everybody. Welcome to today's webinar. My name is Emily Spranger. I'm an academic trainer for the Center for Teaching and Learning, and very happy to have one of our own faculty, Dr. Sharon Kimmel, come present this dissertation webinar to us today. A couple of housekeeping items for you to remember. The chat is open. So if you do want everybody to see any of your comments, there's a little drop down option in the caret where you would need to select all panelists and attendees. Otherwise, the questions just go straight to the Dr. Kimmel and I. So feel free to ask any questions in the chat. But if you do want something to be answered by Dr. Kimmel, write that in the Q&A section as you populate your question in your mind. Make sure you jot that down in the Q&A because Dr. Kimmel, at the appropriate times, will pause and ask if there's any questions. So I'd like you to be able to use that as a tool here in our Zoom. This is going to be recorded. We will post it in our CTL webinar. Oh, someone just asked in the chat. This is going to be recorded and we will post it in our CTL webinar section. So you can, come back to it at any point in time and review the materials. So I think without further ado, I'm going to pass this over to Dr. Kimmel.
Hi, my name is Sharon Kimmel, and I'm going to give you a very brief overview just to let you know that I'm validated to do this. I have been with NCU since 2013, so about 8 years now. And prior to that, I had worked in a large healthcare network as a research scientist. And my doctorate, my PhD is from Lehigh University in research methods, social research methods. I also have a management of technology way of doing things, not necessarily information technology. And I will now move forward. One of the things that I wanted to tell you about myself is that I love road trips. And I am telling you because I thought this might be a really good idea to cushion this webinar in terms of a road trip. I am sure by now you have heard that your dissertation research study is a journey. And as a journey, I think that there are some things that we can relate to taking road trips. One is, of course, that's me. I'm looking at the train. I want to see an overview of where I'm headed. And having said that, for your dissertation research journey, you can use your doctoral student experience rubric to get a feel for where you're headed. You can also use the NCU DP DM template to get a feel for where you're headed. I also do some reading, and that is the DPDM, the Dissertation Student Experience template. I also have many resources that I use, and I'm going to. And of course, I take along a co-pilot, and many people today will use their cell phones as co-pilots, and that's perfectly acceptable. You should always have one by your side, but your co-pilots also in this journey for your research study is your dissertation chair and your committee members. Now, having had said that, I would like very much to take a poll to find out where you, my audience, are at this time, because I can then sort of temper my presentation based on that. So Emily, if we could have the poll, please.
Absolutely. Can you see the poll?
I am able to see the poll. Great. So I want to know where you are in your dissertation journey, and you might still be working on your dissertation proposal and you're on the dissertation proposal highway. You might be going through the institutional review board process right now. And so we consider that crossing the IRB bridge. You may be working on your data analysis. and that's Data Analysis Avenue. You may have already performed your data analysis and are moving on to the Chapter 4 Highway. Or maybe you're just a faculty member here to support the people that are viewing the webinar and myself, in which case I really appreciate that, especially when it comes to the questions.
Okay, great. That's a large percentage that have participated. About 75% have participated in this poll. So are you able to see the data on there, Dr. Kimmel?
I am not.
Okay, let me go ahead. I'm going to hit end poll at this time, and we should see it share the results. Are you able to see?
I am. So it looks as though the majority, 31%, are still working on your dissertation proposal. And I am so happy that you have joined us because, again, you can look at the train and where you're headed. We've got another 27% who are here that have already completed their data analysis, but are working through writing their Chapter 4. We have 15% that are in IRB, 12% doing their data analysis, and hooray, another 27% who are faculty here to support me, and I really appreciate that. Thank you. So having had said that, I want to talk to you a little bit about organizing yourself for your trip. And I am going to go into a data analysis plan. And this is for the, almost 50% of you who have not yet performed or collected your data or performed your data analysis. First, I'm going to sell you on it, and that's the value of a data analysis plan. Some chairs require this, some do not. However, it is extremely important, even though it may take you a little bit of time up front. The value of this is that when you get your data, you are going to be so excited, you're going to be thrilled, and you're going to want to know what your data tells you. And before you do that, you really need to get to know your data, and you need to work with your data a little bit. So the value of the data analysis plan is it's your quality control, it's your quality assurance document. It will help facilitate your understanding of what your data is trying to say to you. And yeah, face it, some data is, can be a little bit messy, a little bit misbehaving, and you can identify whether your data is misbehaving or not. What this does is it mitigates false starts and it mitigates data mistakes. So in doing that, you'll facilitate your results, and overall, it just saves you time. So what is a data analysis plan? It's a systematic, scientific, it's step-by-step. You can share it with your chair, you can share it with a statistician if you're working with one, or you can just keep it to yourself. But it is a procedure for how you will manage your data. And it's very specific, and I will go through a little bit of the specifics and what this data analysis plan should include. It starts with you downloading your data, whether you're getting archived data from another source, whether you have distributed a survey through maybe Qualtrics or SurveyMonkey, and you get your data and you download your data. The first thing that you're going to do is you are going to save your data. I don't care what you call it. You can call it Basecamp, you can call it raw data, but you want to save that, because when you become enmeshed in your data and you're working through it, I'm not sure if you can hear the truck that just went by. When you are enmeshed in your data and you're working through it and you think everything is fine and you happen to make an error that you don't quite catch, you need to have this raw database so that you can go back and capture capture things from the beginning before you had made your error. Another thing that you need to do is you need to get to know your data. No matter how large your data is, download it into SPSS, just take a look through it, stroll through your data, that's the eyeball of the data, run descriptives. And the little SPSS drop box in the right-hand side is to remind me to tell you that when you're running your descriptives, I typically go with a frequency. And when I go with a frequency, if my data is at a ratio level, that is, there's multiple data points, it's not categorical, it's not a Likert scale 1 through 7, you need to click this box down here to suppress the frequency table. Otherwise, you might have like 5 rows of data. But I typically use the frequency so I can get the minimum and the maximum and look for outliers. I can take a look at where the percentages are. I can take a look, I can through the statistics tab, I can run the mean if it's meaningful for me to run the mean. If you run the mean and you're analyzing each of your variables, please understand that that SPSS will give you the mean, but it might not necessarily be meaningful. For example, you might have a survey, you're asking for gender, you're using only male, female, perhaps a third other category. SPSS will give you the mean, like 1.8, but that mean is not necessarily meaningful. So don't report that in your chapter 4. So you need to also, SPSS will tell you how many data points are missing. When you do a data analysis plan up front, you will identify what you will do when there are missing data. If your dependent variable has missing data and you can't compute it, then of course you can't use that case, that subject, that participant. If maybe you're using several survey questions to compile together for a construct, and you need to identify how many of the survey questions, if there's missing data, how many is too many so that you can't compute your other variables, your independent variables. And you might need to do a little bit of data cleaning within SPSS. And of course, you need to re-save at this point. I know I'm going into details, but this is really important so that when you go to write your chapter 4, you have this at your fingertips in order to write the validity and reliability section, which we will get into. And you will have this at your fingertips in order to run your data. And like I said at the beginning, the value is so that you don't have false starts, or you don't have data errors, or you don't jump to the conclusions and find that you haven't done your due diligence. Some of you may have computations, number 4, computations you need to maybe do regrouping or grouping, or perhaps you need to do some reverse coding. In some surveys, in order to capture the maybe honesty or true thoughts of a survey taker, the same topic may be constructed as a question, both in a positive and in a negative format. And then of course you have to do reverse coding. Or you may need to construct, you may need to compute your construct, as I talked about a little bit earlier, maybe multiple survey questions or multiple pieces of archived data that can be averaged or summed together to represent a variable. Keep running checks. Write these checks into your data analysis plan. And then you need to identify for the statistical test that you've chosen what the statistical assumptions are. Parametric tests, your t-tests, your ANOVA, your multiple linear regressions, your MANOVAs, they have data assumptions that need to be met in order to trust the results of the statistical analysis. SPSS will run it for you regardless of whether the data assumptions are met or not, but what it runs and reports to you might not be something that is valid. So understand what these data assumptions are up front. And oh, by the way, if the assumptions are violated, you need to identify what's your next step. many of the parametric tests have non-parametric comparable statistics that you can use that do not have the stringent assumptions that a parametric test would. And then, of course, identify your inferential statistics. We'll get into reading and interpreting output in a little bit later. I know that may have been a lot, and maybe you can stop right here, Emily, to see if there's any questions on the data analysis plan.
There is one in the Q&A right now, and then I just have another question in the chat that I can see. The question in the Q&A is it okay to provide an overview of your data analysis plan in Chapter 4?
We will get into Chapter 4, and yes, a large section of your data analysis plan will be included or incorporated or used in the reliability and validity of the data section of Chapter 4. So that's very intuitive question. Very nice. Yes.
Thank you very much. And then another question that I can see in the chat. I found out the hard way my data cannot be entered in the SPSS. I am using secondary data and do not have raw data. Can I use my secondary data to answer my research question without SPSS?
Without knowing what your data is or the format that it is shaped in, a couple recommendations might be Excel also performs some basic statistics. Not as nice and compact and easy as SPSS, but Excel can certainly do that. But if you can get your data into Excel, then you can transfer your data into SPSS. Now, if your data is not raw data points, rather aggregate data, for example, means and standard deviations and medians, then I would highly recommend that you go to the Academic Success Center and work with the statistician. There are programs out there that will compute, probably, depending on the statistical tests that you're using. There are programs out there that will compute that based, just given the aggregate information and data, but their trustworthiness, I would certainly check with a statistician or your chair in the Academic Success Center.
And Dr. Kimmel, thank you so much for bringing that up, because I do want to just so you know, in the chat they said will do. Thank you. And I'm just going to pop this in the chat right now because for stats help, it's our CTL events calendar. And every single Friday, there's power hour sessions for stats help. So feel free to check that out. You can always check out that calendar. We're trying to offer additional resources in conjunction with the Academic Success Center. And of course, our navigators and some of the coaches. There's one more question, Dr. Kimmel, if that's all right, before we move forward?
Sure.
Okay. Angela wants to know, would you consider test scores 1 through 4 for each of our 4 domains of the English language proficiency as ordinal data, or can it be higher?
I would consider it ordinal data. A rule of thumb is that you need to have a minimum of 5 value points. And this actually really leads into something that I failed to mention previously, and that's in SPSS. You'll notice that when you enter data into SPSS, you need to provide your data labels, data values, if they're categorical, and it will also ask for the measurement type. SPSS does not currently have a measurement type of interval, and many statisticians as well as other researchers will consider Likert scales to be interval. So you need, in order to do the statistical test that you want to, you need to identify that variable as ratio in SPSS. However, when you have only values of 1 through 4, this is not a continuous and cannot be interval. It is definitely categorical. And I'm going to go a step further, when you have a Likert scale values of 1 through 5, and you're looking at your data and you realize that some of your data points, nobody identified the lower end or the higher end. So you only have 4 values. Then you have to regroup and identify it as ordinal. So that's my spiel on the measurement level.
Thank you.
Emily, your report out and in the chat box was very timely on the Academic Success Center, because that was my next slide. One of the tips that you're going to find continuously streamlined throughout this presentation is to get help when you need it. That doesn't mean don't do your due diligence and try to figure it out, but it means that I understand and identify when you need help. I'm going to do a little bit of a side trip for you. Like here's me and, on my road trip, but I don't have that, but I'm going to give a little bit of a side trip. When I was doing my dissertation research study, my research study was on basic research, and I needed to do some comparison with what a previous dissertation candidate did about 5 years previously. And by now that dissertation candidate had graduated, and they had a very, high powerful job in AT&T, and I was just this little dissertation candidate. And so I had to replicate what the previous candidate had done, and I could not replicate it. I just could not replicate it. I spent maybe 6-7 months of trying hard to figure it out on my own. And I was becoming frustrated. I was losing confidence in myself. And finally, I humbled myself and I went to my statistician on my committee and I said, I just can't do this. And we figured out that although I wasn't 100% right, I was doing some structural equation modeling. Even though I wasn't 100% right, the previous candidate was not either. So it took me 6 months of wasted time that I could have played around after I graduated with this data set. I wasted the 6 months. So please do not think that we, as your chairs and dissertation committee, think that you need to know everything there is to know. What you need to know is when you need some help, where to get that help. That's part of independent learning. And you also need to know how to apply that help. So, here's my spiel on the, here are your sources. Remember your sources, and contacting your chair and contacting the Academic Success Center. One of the areas that I would like to point out is in the NCU library, they have an A through Z database with many SAGE research methods, videos, and text on how to do something. There is another area, if you're not anywhere near at the NCU website, there is a site called Layered Dissertation Research. All you have to do is go out and search for LAERD. It's put out by Lund Research. It's a free website up to a point. It will outline for you what is by statistical test, what the test is about, what the assumptions are, and it'll show you how to perform that test in SPSS, and I also think that they might be able to do it in another statistical software program, but most of our candidates use SPSS. You can also, when you get to the point of running your stats, you can also become a member, and you can, I think it's very inexpensive, $10 for a month of membership. This is where you do your due diligence before you go to your statistician, or while you're going to your statistician. So from here, I am going to take you on a tour of Chapter 4. And when I take you on the tour of Chapter 4, I am going to use the Dissertation Student Experience rubric to show you what is expected of you. And I'm going to use the Dissertation Student Experience DM template to show you the outline that's there. I think my slides are mixed up. I wanted to show you how to get to the Dissertation Student Experience rubric if you don't already know. Many of you have seen this. This is when you log into the doctoral record, you see this chart, and you can click on, when you clicked on Chapter 1 to submit your Chapter 1, the same with Chapter 2 and 3. You're now thinking about Chapter 4. When you click on Chapter 4, go back, you will see this come up. And in this pop-up menu, you can go to the assessment. This is what I will be using, and this is what your chair and subject matter expert will be using when they review your Chapter 4. It doesn't matter if you select the chair or the SME, but when you click on that, you'll be taken into the rubric. Both the chair and the SME rubric are the same. So let's start with the introduction. There's not really a lot to say with the introduction. It's pretty, pretty sweet and to the point. The rubric says that an adequate overview of the purpose of the research is provided. And what you need to avoid is being overly lengthy or having unneeded discussion. By the way, a caveat is that these rubric criteria are the bare minimum. Make sure that your chair and your subject matter expert will provide you with feedback that will facilitate a robust dissertation manuscript. Please remember your dissertation manuscript is going to be published in ProQuest for all the world to see and read. In the dissertation, I'm just going to call it the template, the DM template. In the DM template, it will talk to you about the purpose and the chapter outline. Check with your chair. I typically ask my candidates to include their problem statement. This is very quick, just an overview. Here's what the problem is, and here's the purpose, and here's the outline of this chapter. Why do I ask for the problem statement? Well, the reason I ask my candidates to put the problem statement in is because think of it, by now, when you read your journal articles, you're probably not starting at the very beginning and reading each section through one at a time. You're probably jumping to the good stuff, the conclusion or the methods or recommendations. You're just jumping to the good stuff. When you publish on ProQuest and someone goes out and looks at your dissertation manuscript, they're not going to start with your introduction section of Chapter 1. They're going to jump to the good stuff. So you might as well give them a little bit of background so they can understand what your good stuff in results section is all about. That's why I asked for the problem. That's why the purpose statement is there. And that's why the chapter outline is there. Now we're going to move on to the validity and reliability of data section. This section, remember your DAP? Remember the question about where to use the DAP in Chapter 4? Well, this is a really, really good place for you to go back and visit your DAP. This is a data analysis plan, DAP. And this is also a really good place for you to go back and revisit your Chapter 3. The criteria that you're going to need to meet is that you describe the validity and reliability of the data, meaning you did your due diligence. And you're going to identify factors that impact the interpretation of the data collection plan or data collection and your analysis. We're going to also get into some threats to validity and in a moment, and that's really important to include in here. You also need to include the assumptions of the statistical test. And in the DM template, it will lead you through most of these, but not necessarily in the detail that I'd like to go into. Go back to chapter 3 and look at your recruitment processes. Your recruitment processes will speak to whether or not you captured the appropriate data. Now, I know some of you, and I think one of you had already asked about archive data. So here's, instead of recruitment, it's the validity of the data that you did use in the validity of the archive data that you used, including what the archive data was originally captured for and how the archive data meets the requirements of your variable within your research question that you're exploring. I'm going to take you forward to some plausible threats to validity. No research is perfect, and your research will not be perfect. Your due diligence is to understand, identify and understand some of the limitations, if you will, of your data set, including, and these are internal and external threats to validity. I put this in, I developed this for one of our research courses in the School of Business, and this information is widely available. The originators, I don't know originators, but one of the first is in 1963. It's Don Campbell, C-A-M-P-B-E-L-L, Campbell and Stanley. They have a very nice, very little book on threats to internal and external validity that has some really nice matrices to use. And I think it's still out there in publication somewhere. Another area where you can go for a pretty good discussion on validity and threats to internal and external validity is TROCHIM, T-R-O-C-H-I-M. I believe that is available in the NCU library. And in the NCU library, there's also resources in that A through Z database that I showed you with the SAGE research methods. So what is internal validity? Internal validity is the extent that what you've detected in your data is a true reflection of reality or a true reflection of the participants that you're representing. Some of the concerns are that your independent variable is indeed responsible for the variation of your dependent variable. I'm not going to go through each of these, but I'll give you just a few little considerations. For example, history is a huge one that we're seeing right now. History is an event that occurs, and not necessarily beforehand, but it could be beforehand. It could occur simultaneously with when you're collecting your data. One of the primary examples of this is the COVID-19. You may be doing research on the way teachers teach reading in the classroom. COVID-19 pandemic, and all of a sudden everything is online. This doesn't mean that your research is invalid. It means that you need to consider how your survey takers answered your survey, assuming you have a survey. They probably answered the survey based on their recollection as opposed to what they're currently doing right now. COVID-19 has really taken a toll on many research studies, including recruitment techniques. You may have identified in your inclusion and exclusion criteria the population that would best represent, or the sampling frame that would best represent the participants that you're investigating or exploring. And then with the pandemic, you needed to make some changes and some revisions, or you didn't get the sample that you needed. So that's a very recent example of a threat to validity based on history. Subject predisposition down here is another that is commonly seen in some of the dissertation research studies. And that could be that when you recruit, the people that you recruit are volunteering to participate in your research study in the majority of cases. And these participants come to the research study with a certain predisposition. In addition to ethical considerations of coercion, one of the research-based reasons to not include family and friends and people that you've been talking about your research to in your sample is because they come with a predisposition. Whether that predisposition is knowing what you're wanting to get out of this and maybe responding in a certain way so that you realize what you want to realize, or maybe responding in a different way if they maybe don't like you, but the subject predisposition will influence how they respond to your survey, or maybe even how they, if you're doing an observational study, how they're reacting, right? Threats to external validity. External validity is just making sure that you can generalize beyond the sample to the population of interest. And you're part of your inclusion and exclusion criteria, the reason that you're making it so tight to represent a homogeneous sample speaks to this. There's sampling bias that you might want to consider. There's the interaction of selection and treatment. And this may sound like it's woven together with some of the internal validity threats of the predisposition and maybe even the history. And it is, because a lot of this is very related. So I would recommend going out to your resources and going through the threats to validity one by one and trying to conceptualize and identify if that relates to your particular experience in recruiting and your data instrument. It also I would recommend, if it does, trying to conceptualize and verbalize, or in writing, how that may impact interpretation, because that is simply what this is all about. It's not that your data or your research is not good. All data has limitations and problems and threats to validity. It's how you're going to interpret your data going forward. So I'm going back now. So you want to talk about in addition to your recruitment and data collection procedures, possible threats to validity, then you're going to go into your statistical piece. You're going to show that you did your due diligence in data cleaning and your due diligence in transforming in the transformation of any computations that you needed to do. You don't have to go into long, lengthy discussions. You just need to let your audience know that you are aware of possible problems that could occur in your data cleaning and transformation, and that you were very conscious of following your data analysis plan. And then, of course, you need to include your statistical assumptions. And those are the data assumptions that I talked to you about when we talked about the data analysis plan. And if there were any violations, what did you do with that? Did you need to maybe do transformation of your data? Did you maybe decide to do a non-parametric test? Or did you maybe just wish it away and you have some sources that you can do, that you can use to support that you wished away that violation? I think that sums it up for the validity and reliability of data. For some of you who have developed your own research or your own survey, there is a procedure to validate that your survey is measuring exactly what you purport it to measure. And it's exploratory or confirmatory factor analysis. Although the student version of SPSS, you'll be doing a principal component analysis. It's beneficial when you have constructs and using multiple survey questions to average or sum to represent a construct, that you also perform the principal component analysis. And this really should be part of your data analysis plan. You need to discuss with your chair whether they would like that information in the reliability and validity of data section or in the results section. Emily, I'm not sure of the time. Do we have time for a few questions if there's questions that we might need to go through?
We do have time for some questions, so please feel free to post those in the Q&A. And in the meantime, while we wait to see if anybody does have any other questions, I have one in the Q&A. And that is from Leon. How do we verbalize the utilization of companies such as Qualtrics services to obtain survey data? And then Leon gives the example of recruitment. Okay.
I think what Leon, I think what you're asking is, or what you've done is you've outsourced your recruitment process to Qualtrics to identify survey takers. Qualtrics does offer this service, and you can identify with Qualtrics what your inclusion and exclusion criteria is. In the reliability and validity of data section, you do need to disclose that you've done this, that you're assuming that Qualtrics has done their due diligence. When you do put together a survey, at the beginning of your survey, you will have your inclusion and exclusion criteria questions. For example, are you 18 years of age and older? Do you have 10 years of experience as a teacher or 10 years of experience as a manager or project manager or something of that nature? And your participants have to select yes in order to continue on in the survey. You have no control of identifying whether the person that is selecting yes is being honest in their selection. But you do need to disclose that. And I wouldn't consider it to be a large threat to validity. Yeah.
Dr. Kimmel, he says, yes, you are correct about that. But also Leon says, I'm using a validated permission granted survey.
Excellent.
Okay.
Okay, excellent. A validated permission granted, survey is a wonderful thing for all of you who are going through, writing through, or developing your dissertation research studies, because you can talk about the validity and reliability that the authors have performed on their survey. And you will also include that not only in chapter 3, but give a brief overview in the reliability and validity of data. However, please understand that whenever you use somebody else's survey, especially if you've changed a word or the sequence of the questions, you are compromising the validity and the reliability of the survey from how it was tested for validity and reliability by the original authors. Your chair may ask you to also do a principal component analysis, or they may decide that your sampling frame and use of the survey wasn't all that significantly different. So check with your chair and do make sure that you put the original validity and reliability information overview in that section.
Thank you, Dr. Kimmel, for that. And thank you, Leon, for your question. Another couple of questions in the Q&A. Kevin has a question. What is meant by evidence of psychometric soundness?
Psychometric properties are the properties of an instrument. Part of what I was talking about with does the question or the test question or the survey question, does it measure what you're purporting it to measure? So evidence of that is indeed your reliability statistic, which is typically a Cronbach's alpha. It's also some validity. In order to establish true validity, it takes multiple replications of a test instrument or a survey to across populations and across time in order to do that. Back to Leon's question, he has a survey that has been validated and has been reliable, considered reliable. So that's part of what might be considered evidence of psychometric properties. I think that's what the term that you used. If you're using a testing instrument, there is a whole statistical discipline on psychometric analysis. So I'm not really sure what school you're coming out of, whether it's or what specifically you're talking about. I'm going to refer to your chair and refer to a statistician.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Dr. Kimmel. One more question. One of our students would like to outsource their survey as well. They need information on how to do that. Where would be the first place to go?
To outsource their survey.
Yeah, I think they want to do something like Leon had mentioned.
Got it. Okay. Yeah, I did use that term. Okay, so Qualtrics, I would go to Qualtrics. Qualtrics, it will cost you, and it can be costly. However, you will be collecting your data using Qualtrics, and NCU has an agreement with Qualtrics where you can collect your data or receive a Qualtrics account for free. SurveyMonkey, on the other hand, will charge you for your data collection. And typically it's very costly, especially questions over like 10, I think it was the last that I had heard from a candidate. So I would go to Qualtrics.
And I had also heard with that SurveyMonkey, sometimes they charge you for every single participant, and then even by the question is something that I have heard as well too.
It can be costly. And I had some candidates who have used SurveyMonkey, and SurveyMonkey also was not flexible. And I'm not really sure about Qualtrics, but SurveyMonkey was not flexible in being able to identify the appropriate survey takers that met my candidate's inclusion criteria. So I would definitely go with Qualtrics.
Okay,
Right,
and
I think, go ahead.
oh, I know there are some resources for that as well too. If you go to LibGuides, or I also know the IRB works with Qualtrics as well too. We have a couple of webinars on that as well too. So if you have questions, you can always go there and use that as a resource.
Thank you. All right, we're going to move into results. I am going to move through the results section quickly because I hope that you will develop and write your research or your results section very quickly. Please note that the results section is only the results. There is no interpretation. So in a quantitative research study, this section can be one of the easier sections to develop. What they're looking for, what your expectations are, is that the results are in line with your research questions. The dissertation manuscript template will ask you to use your research questions as your headings or your subheadings under results. And you need to not include any interpretation. Now, there is the interpretation of whether your null hypothesis is failed to be rejected or rejected, but you have to be careful of identifying or stating what you think the results mean. We will get into that in the evaluation of findings section, so you will have the opportunity to do that. Just the results. Avoid any interpretation. I think I've mentioned that 6 times now, except for the statistical significance. Please identify whether you failed to reject the null hypothesis or whether the null hypothesis was rejected. That's stat terms. Use your tables and your graphs to communicate your data. And then, of course, in APA format and fashion, you need to identify for your audience what are the key takeaways from your table and your graph. Do include demographics if they're appropriate and relevant, and do organize by research questions. Include your descriptive statistics as needed to define your variables, and then your inferential stat output. One of the things that I want to move into and stress is that many times what I see is that most dissertation research studies are developed and set up with the hope to reject the null hypothesis and find something that is statistically significant. In many cases, this might not be the end result. And I have seen many a candidate become discouraged at this point. And I really want to impress on you that if you fail to reject the null hypothesis, all is not lost. Don't become frustrated. Don't become upset. Don't lose your steam. I get it. You know, you've worked hard, and this is, you know, it's not taking you where you thought you wanted to go. Let me see if I can put it in terms of a road trip. Let's say that you get up in the morning and you get yourself ready and you're going to go up to the top of Pikes Peak, right? And you start out on your journey and a storm comes. And so you don't make it all the way up to the top of Pikes Peak. You only make it 3/4 of the way up. But hey, I got to tell you that just because you didn't make it where you wanted to go to doesn't mean that you didn't see some wonderful things and make some great discoveries along the way, even though you made it up 3/4. That I don't know if that's a really good analogy, because you have accomplished what you wanted to accomplish. Please remember what your goal is. Your goal is to graduate, right? That's what your goal is. So, here's where you really need to get back to work. Here's where you need to think and reconsider your threats to validity. You need to reconsider why maybe you didn't reject the null hypothesis, why you didn't find the statistical significance. Research is evolutionary. Not all researchers find a statistical significance, even though they want to. Research builds upon research. That's where they have the saying, standing on the back of giants. And you are part of that puzzle piece. Your finding is a finding. So get back to work. This is you being an independent researcher. This is you discovering what's going on and how to apply that and how to interpret it. Which brings us to our next section, which is, it brings me to go back to your resources, look at your resources. I also wanted to take a brief moment and also remind you that APA formatting, APA style also has formatting requirements for statistical outputs. And I did look this up this morning, the Academic Success Center. If you go to the Academic Success Center and you go to APA style, along the side, you'll see a menu for discussing stats in text. And also, as Emily pointed out, I believe it's on Fridays, there is stats writing group sessions. You can also go to your APA manual. You can go to APA style blogs. There is APA style at datasciencecentral.com. Okay. All right. So we're going to move on to the evaluation of sections, but first we need to get some nourishment. And what do I mean by that? In order to complete the evaluation of finding sections, you need nourishment. And your nourishment is going to come from revisiting your statement of the problem, your purpose of the study, introduction of chapter 1, and relevant sections of chapter 2. Don't forget your conceptual framework or your theoretical framework, especially if you're performing the PhD theoretical research study. You will use this information to discuss interpretations of your findings. And in order to do that, you need to look toward or look back as what we think we already know in the literature, or what we think we know from the theory or the conceptual framework, if you used a model, to frame your research study. So don't forget to stop and go back and look. It will make this next section much easier for you. So evaluation of findings, here is your expectations. And again, bare minimum, rely on your chair. You're going to describe what the findings, what your results or your findings mean. And the discussion will, of course, include your theoretical and conceptual framework, but most will be compared to the scholarly literature. That's what we think we already know. What you need to avoid is something that's unclear or overly long. So what I did is I pulled together a few examples. The first example is when you go, my findings, they're right along with what we think we know out there in the literature, not very surprising. That's a really good thing. So you might want to say something like, in similar research studies, research purported that XYZ has been empirically shown to increase ABC as was the result for this sample, your sample. And of course, make sure that you use your sources to cite and support. Another, well, this isn't really surprising. I'm in line with things. You might write something like, findings from this research mirrors past research such that ABC has the possibility to influence XYZ. And then you also, of course, use your citations to support. And incidentally, most of these should already be within your chapter 1 introduction or your chapter 2, or even in the statement of the problem, or in your chapter 2 literature review section. And of course, the theoretical and conceptual framework, which we'll get into in another example. But what if your results are a little bit mixed and you're not quite sure yet? So you might want to say something like, when compared to previous research, the overall results of this study were a little mixed. So-and-so, in this case, Hannigan, suggested that ABC does not influence XYZ, whereas in another researcher's research, they suggested that ABC does influence XYZ. So for this research, here are my findings. And then this one is bringing in your theoretical framework. So the findings were inconsistent with the theoretical framework and the literature review of the current study, rooted in the whatever theory that you used. It was expected to predict X because this is related to Y when Z is a moderator variable. So that would be something that you might want to write. Maybe it's inconsistent, and that's okay to be inconsistent. Again, you're adding your puzzle piece to the larger puzzle to get a feel for what we think we know out there on the topic that you have. So we're creating a picture of that topic. And then, you might want to bring in some of your threats to validity, and you might say something like, caution is necessary in the interpretation of data from this research because of limitations imposed by small sample size, associated problems and generalizing results to the population of interest. Describe the characteristics for this sample. Noting that you're only saying caution is necessary in these interpretations. Another thought might be, despite concerns about generalizability, study results for this sample follow this trends, and the directional hypothesis was not realized, or something like that. So you can then maybe say this aligns with the findings of other people in the literature, or this does not align with the findings of other people in the literature. I'm going to go through the sample or the summary section real quick, and then we can go to some questions. Summary, you've written, what, 3 of these already? Keep it to the key points, please. And that is your chapter 4. You have your introduction. You have your validity and reliability of data, your results section, your evaluation of findings, and your summary. Done. So I know I did a lot of talking, and if nothing else that you take away, I hope you might kind of visualize some of these icons. Look at your overview of where you're headed. Look at the terrain. You can even do this when you're writing chapter 3. Chapter 2 and chapter 3 can really set you up well for your chapter 4, for those of you that are still on dissertation proposal highway. Make sure that you absolutely, take 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 advantage of the template, the resources that are available, the Center for Teaching and Learning, your committee members. Don't do as I did and sit there for 6 months, being frustrated and losing confidence. But your role as a researcher is to also identify how you're going to apply that. Make a data analysis plan. I can't stress that enough. Keep it simple, keep it straight. Make sure you get your nourishment. Bring others along with you. These are the statisticians, the chairs, your friends, other people. Remember your goal. Remember your goal is to graduate. And of course, always, always, always keep your chair and your subject matter expert by your side. Questions?
Thank you so much, Dr. Kimmel. I do have 2 questions in the chat, or the Q&A, excuse me, before we wrap up. Should the evaluations and findings area be the only section of Chapter 4 area where we reference citations, where reference citations are used, I should say?
That's a really good question, and I probably glazed over that because I started hurrying, and the answer to that is no. You will use your sources for your stat analysis, for the data assumptions, when you identify, whether you are rejecting or failing to reject your null hypothesis. So most of the results section is your stat sources.
Thank you for that. And then last question in the Q&A before we wrap up today. Is there a recommended page count for Chapter 4 in a quantitative method manuscript?
I don't think so. I don't know. I don't think so. I do want to stress to keep, when you do your writing, be as clear as possible. Use simple sentences. You don't assume that you need to use, $50 words or long convoluted sentences, because that just makes it more complex and complicated, and your reader won't understand what you're saying. Keep it simple. Keep the results section simple. Use your tables to communicate your data. So I don't think there is a page number.
And I know I mentioned that was the last one, but I just want to ask this last question. So if we don't reject the null, don't lose confidence? Question mark.
Do not lose confidence. You still have a finding. You absolutely still have a finding. You still have discovered something. And it might not be where you wanted to go. It might not be what you wanted to discover, but you've got to figure out what it is you did discover. And that's part of the research journey. That's being a good researcher. That's being an independent learner. You need to go out and you need to say, well, I didn't realize what I wanted to realize, because you really shouldn't start your dissertation with, I'm going to prove something, because that's not what that you're exploring, and you discovered something. So go with it.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kimmel. Thank you for all of our attendees as well too. And as a reminder, it will be posted in the CTL webinar LibGuide section, and I'll have it up there in about the next 24 hours. But I just want to thank you so much, Dr. Kimmel, for coming back and sharing this information with us, and we appreciate your time and your expertise.
Thank you. And I see that I went over time, so thanks everyone for hanging in there with me.
Absolutely. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.
Yeah, bye-bye.